Hello! Yes, you are tuned to the Rockhaven YouTube channel or our podcast. I know some of you are looking at your screen right now wondering, what did I tune into? But this is the Rockhaven podcast, and John McCosh is not here today. My name is Owen Gustafson. I'm part of the leadership team at Rockhaven Church, and happy to be with you today. I'm going to find out how weird this is. I think John's been preaching to a camera now for 12 weeks. This is, I think, number 13, and it looks different looking at a camera lens than it does looking at a congregation of people. When you're speaking, you're used to feedback from people, to see faces, and to hear things. And this is that camera lens doesn't do anything; it just stares at you. So this will be a little different, but it'll be my turn to experience the camera lens. So let's dive in. Before we start this morning, I want to mention that it was on Friday of this past week that the funeral was for Ravi Zacharias. Some of you know that name and some of you don't. Ravi Zacharias was born in Delhi, India. At the age of 17, he determined his life was pretty over and pretty useless, and nobody liked him, and his expectations of others could not be met by his life, so he attempted suicide. And while he was laying in his bed in the hospital in Delhi, India, a man came by and just put a Bible in his room, and when his mother came, she took the Bible and opened it up to a verse in John where it said, "Because I live, you shall live also." And that verse changed his life. And from the age of 17 to when he passed away last week, at the age of 74, his life was one that was devoted to preaching, teaching, and devoted to the wisdom that comes from above. It was my privilege to listen to a lot of his things, to learn from him. And in our text today it says we aren't supposed to be envious of anything, but I am envious of the way he could communicate with a crowd, especially a crowd that was adversarial, that disagreed with him. I am going to, we don't normally do this, but I'm going to recommend this book to you. This is the last book he wrote. It's The Logic of God, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the book, and I'm going to tell you why I recommend it. In this book, there's 52 chapters. Now, if you look at how thick the book is, you'll realize that those chapters can't be very thick, and they aren't. It's 52 bullet points. Christian essentials for the heart and mind. Ravi Zacharias was a very deep teacher. He taught at great depth. And finally, later in life, last year in fact, people said, would you put together something that's just the brief things that are the most important to you in a devotional form? And so he did this book. And there's 52 of those essentials for the heart and mind from 4 decades of preaching, 4 decades of being an influence around the world for Christ. And he put it in this book. And here's the reason I'm recommending it to you. I got my copy when it came out in August of last year, and I had it here in the house, and my granddaughters had stopped. I'd taken the one out fishing, and the other one came, and they were on their way to Florida, and they were in a hurry, and I had some other books to give to her. And I gave her the other books, and I picked this one up, and I said, you should get this book. This is the book that Ravi Zacharias just came out with. You'll like it. It's really good. And I told her about the first chapter, and that first chapter, his point about the heart and mind is to remember that behind every question, there's a questioner. He says, when you give an answer for the hope that is within you, don't be a person who's trying to win an argument. Be a person that's trying to win the person who's making the argument. So he would be very, very thoughtful with people who disagreed with him. He would find out the core questions of what was really bothering them, and he would answer them. And I told my granddaughter, you should get this book, and then we had a flurry of activity, and they were hurried to leave, and they were gone, and later that evening when I went looking for my book, it was gone also. Because when I said, you should get this book, she thought I had said, here, take this book. Well, it was gone, my brand new book. I kind of pouted for a little bit, but I went, and ordered a new one and got my copy again. And then the day he died, within hours after his death, she posted this on her social media page. I praise God for the life of Ravi and the gifting with so much wisdom to teach and affect so many lives. Ravi's book The logic of God was pivotal in my walk, and his podcasts have been there to bring so much clarity in chaos. Boy, this old grandpa was never so happy to be a part of a misunderstanding. To have her have that book make that much impact tells me that, hey, it might for you too. We've been talking a lot, and John's been talking about growing through this time of the COVID when we're not together. And part of that is to have resources. And I think this, because of her testimony, what she said, and because I know what Ravi has in his book, it'd be a great resource for you as we're growing together in grace. Let's pray this morning before we begin. Father, thank you for the life, the testimony of Ravi Zacharias and the impact that he had in a world. Just pray that as we look to your word this morning, we look to those words in James about the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom that comes from above, the wisdom of God, that you would open our eyes and open our hearts to the value of being people who firmly entrenched and live out with wisdom, the wisdom from above, the wisdom from you. Thank you so much for being here this morning. Ask your blessing in Jesus' name. Joel, I lost that piece of paper. I'm going to need that later, so I'll have you get that at some point. We got a little breeze here in the backyard, and thank goodness, because we also have a few gnats. Joel is here, and we are both loaded up with mosquito spray. Pretty good. And I think it's going to keep the gnats away. And for those of you that put this up on your big screen TV, you will see the gnats. They're not bothering because we smell really bad because we're full of DEET right now. But good to be here. We're in my backyard. Up in rural Maynard, not down at, we aren't going to compete with John to have airplanes flying over and tractors driving by and semis. I think it's going to be quiet, and that'll be good. One of the examples of Ravi Zacharias' gift of grace, of how to communicate to a crowd that's basically hostile to what he had to say. He was invited to speak at UCLA, University of California in Los Angeles one time. It was a Veritas Forum. The theme was, is tolerance intolerant? Pursuing the climate of acceptance and inclusion. And that's a tough topic if you're going to UCLA. And he got there and the crowd gave him a very warm welcome. And he got up and he just simply said, I hope you're still that welcoming when we're done today. Because he said, I know what I have to say is not going to be agreeable to many of you. But then he proceeded to lay out the basis to identify with them, to know where they were coming from. And then he brought in the truth of God's word and powerfully explained why that made much more sense than the ideas of secularism, of pluralism, of privatization. I'm envious of that ability. But with God's grace, we can grow. We become people who are able to share wisdom with the world. We continue in James 3. As you're turning, or James 3, 13 through 18 for today, the wisdom of the world versus the wisdom of God. In Ravi's worldview, he wrote a study a couple years ago. And in many ways, the wisdom of the world or the wisdom of God, it's basically your worldview, my worldview, how we view life in this world. What are the things that are important to us as we live life, as we do what we do, as we think what we think. And he said there's 4 things that everybody has in their worldview. Everybody has an idea of origins, of meaning, of morality, and destiny. Everyone has some idea of where they came from, and we have all created and defined a meaning for life where we get purpose. And we all have a morality of how we should live life. What are the rules that we live life by? Then everyone has some sense of destiny. What happens when we die? And he says those 4 things comprise your worldview. those four things are what determine how you live your life. James has been called the Proverbs of the New Testament because it's very much the wisdom book. In the Proverbs we see a lot of writings, a lot of times the word wisdom is used, and James in his writing uses the word wisdom quite a bit. Proverbs 16:16, how much better is it to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is to be chosen above silver. 1 Corinthians 1:20, where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Proverbs 14:12, there is a way which seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And Romans 12:2, and do not be conformed to this world. Can I add the word wisdom? Do not be conformed to this world's wisdom, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Somebody asks, well, what is wisdom? We all know what knowledge is. We can get knowledge everywhere. We can go on the Google. We can go on the Wikipedia. You can find all the knowledge that you need or want or could ever use. But wisdom is how to take that knowledge, how to apply it to life, how to make it work for you at the level of life. And that's true wisdom. The ability to make the right choices in life. Proverbs 4:7 and 8, the beginning of wisdom is acquire wisdom, and with all your acquiring get understanding. Prize her, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. Isaiah 55 says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. In the Old Testament, we think of Solomon as the man who was given more wisdom than anyone else in the world. When God asked him, you ask me for anything you want, I'll give it to you. And he said, I would want wisdom. The only mistake he made, he didn't ask for God's wisdom. He got the wisdom, basically, of the world. At the end of his life, he wrote Ecclesiastes. In Ecclesiastes 2:11, he says this I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted, and behold, all was vanity, and striving after the wind, and there was no profit under the sun. At the end of the life, he realized that all he had done, because it was worldly wisdom, all he had accomplished was simply what he called striving after the wind. You can probably hear it out in the trees. There's a little wind. We're sheltered here, but we can hear the noise out there, and it's quite a concept to strive after the wind. It's like chasing something that you can't possibly catch, but you're going to keep chasing it. That's what Solomon said the summary of his life was, by having wisdom that didn't bring him to God, but brought him everything else that he could desire. At the end of the book, in Ecclesiastes 12:13, he says, the conclusion, when all has been heard, is fear God and keep his commandments. After accomplishing everything a man could possibly accomplish in life, he said that was chasing after the wind, but he said, for you, young man, fear God and keep his commandments. Finally, at the end of life, he had seen what heavenly wisdom was all about. Many profess Christ, but allow the wisdom of this world to affect the way we think and the way we practice our faith. We live in a very secular age, and unless we're careful, the thinking, the wisdom of secularism will affect the way we think, the way we do our life, and we will be separated from the wisdom of God. As I started this study, and I was kind of glad that last week John got the part on Proverbs, or on James on the tongue, So I thought, boy, I wouldn't want that one, because I would have plenty of examples of what goes wrong with the tongue. I would be, and then there was this time and this time and this time, and I thought, I'm glad he had that, because I would just have a half-hour examples of how not to do it. So I thought, well, this will be easy, or easier. But then when you started studying about earthly wisdom and godly wisdom, as James presents it in his passage, and then you realize the conversations that you were a part of, the conversations that you were hearing, and the things that were going on around you during the week, and it was just, you just about caught your breath. That, wait a minute, I'm not seeing really the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom, but now when it's brought out to me, now I see it. It's almost scary how it can drag you into a way of thinking that doesn't have a good end. It doesn't glorify God. It doesn't bring you to a place in life where you will have peace and joy and understanding and satisfaction in life. And so, whatever happens today, however my communication skills, I will guarantee you, I got way more out of this study than I can possibly convey to you. It was a great week of study for me, and I hope some of that, most of that, all of that, or I hope it ignites within you a desire to dig deeper into what earthly wisdom and godly wisdom is, and the contrast, and how it works for us. James 3, 13 through 18. He starts out with a question. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without hypocrisy. And the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Just as back a couple chapters ago, James says, faith without works is dead. Now he says almost the same thing about wisdom. He says, who is wise in understanding? Let him show. If you have wisdom, if I have wisdom, if we have godly wisdom, let him show by his good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom. So it's the same theme for James. There needs to be an action that happens along with wisdom. There's an interesting word that probably you have in your translation when you get down to verse 17, when he gives the descriptions of wisdom about pure, peaceful, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy. One of the words you might have in your translation is sincere. And when you look up that word, the Greek word used for sincere, it's a word that means without wax. See, if you made a pot, and they made a lot of pots back in those days, pottery, and it had a crack in it, you would fill the crack with wax, and then you would put that final glaze coat over it, but nobody would see that it was cracked. But if the pot was without crack, without wax, it was sincere. No, there was one pastor that looked that up and he found that word, and instead of signing his correspondence sincerely after that, he wrote without wax. It's pure. There's no cracks. That's what the sincere means. He begins with the question, and then he goes right into the wisdom of the world. When he first makes this statement, let him sow by his good behavior his deeds and the gentleness of wisdom. And right there, it goes into the wisdom of the world. If you have bitter jealousy, selfish ambition, in your heart. Do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. The wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every other thing. He doesn't tell us, but I think this is, James lived this. James was a half-brother of Jesus, and certainly he lived and he saw a religious system in his day where there was bitter jealousy, there was selfish ambition. A selfish ambition where people wouldn't look at the truth, but they finally put the source of all truth, Jesus, on the cross. And as his half-brother, James, we see he really wasn't a believer in who Jesus was until Jesus rose from the dead and he appeared to him. And that radically changed his life. And he became a believer. He became a head of the Jerusalem church, and he wrote this book, and he knows very much firsthand what it meant to see and live around and be a part of selfish ambition and the bitter jealousy that existed. And if you and I look around at people that proclaim wisdom, you can see plenty of examples of bitter jealousy, selfish ambition in our culture today. Tim Keller is a preacher, started a church out in Brooklyn. He talks about the things that we can only get from a lasting and true understanding of true wisdom and what life is all about. He says there's meaning and identity and freedom and hope and satisfaction can only happen if you make Jesus the reason for your life. Embracing him as Lord and Savior, he says that's the only way that can happen. And Tim Keller, by saying that, he's describing his version of true wisdom. Wisdom of a worldview that says we were created by God. We were put here for a purpose. There's a reason. The reason is to know him and to make him known. And when that happens, then meaning, identity, freedom, hope, and satisfaction become a realization of a life that has grabbing on to heavenly wisdom. There was a gnat. I think I ate one, Joel. So, if you're here this morning and you're listening, you say, I want that. That sounds great. I want that wisdom that comes from above. How do I get that? Where does it come from? How can I just stop this treadmill that I'm on? And we did get off the treadmill a little bit when COVID hit. Everything changed. And perhaps now is the time to just step back and look at life and say, yeah, I was being drawn into a secular form of wisdom, but I want the wisdom that comes from God. I want a life that gives me a satisfaction that I do not get and I cannot see, even in the secular world. I would like that. How does that happen? 3 things. Number 1, knowing God. Have a relationship with the God of heaven through his Son, Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, being a Christian is often compared to marriage. And I love the first part of that comparison. When you get married, there's the ceremony. You're up in front. You're in front of the pastor. He turns you around when it's done, and he pronounces you man and wife and introduces you. You're married. You can't possibly be any more married than you are at that moment. But that's day 1 of your marriage relationship. A relationship that's going to grow or tragically flounder for people But it is day one of that relationship. And the beautiful comparison to being a Christian is Jesus makes that invitation to say, believe in what I've done for you. Become a Christian. By faith, accept the gift that I offer through my death on the cross. And you say, yes. We're told in the Bible that the comparison is Jesus is the bridegroom. And the church is the bride of Christ. When we've accepted that offer that he makes to us, that he says, believe, we become a part of the bride of Christ. We've said yes. And you can't become any more of a Christian than you are at that moment when you said yes. But it's day one of a relationship with Jesus. A relationship that should grow and should flourish throughout all of life. And that true is heavenly wisdom. To know him and to understand that it isn't about what I do, it isn't the works, it's the works that he done and I receive, and then I have the privilege of growing with him throughout life. Number two then is to seek his instructions. Psalm 119, the first 5 verses. How blessed are those whose way is blameless, who walk in the law of the Lord. How blessed are those who observe his testimonies, who seek him with all their heart. They also do no unrighteousness. They walk in his ways. Thou hast ordained thy precepts, that we should keep them diligently. Oh, that my ways may be established to keep thy statutes. We seek his instructions. And the preacher that had these 3 points, the last one he had was act accordingly. James, at the end of his, at verse 18, he said, and the seed whose fruit is righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Once again, there's that word fruit. You know, and I thought, where's the comparison? Act accordingly. That's I don't like that phrase. It's an act, then. Act accordingly. It's do something. When I was thinking about it, it was the day I was planting garden. And I was planting some tomatoes. And they're behind Joel over there, and they're only about this high, but they'll start growing. And they'll grow and grow and grow. And then pretty soon, in late June, they'll put out some blossoms, and then they will put on fruit. And I thought, there's something there. There's a comparison there to the Christian. Nobody has to tell the tomato plant at the end of June, okay, by the way, I don't have to go out there and put up a sign, flower now, make fruit. Do it. It just comes naturally because the tomato plant is doing what the tomato plant does as it's growing. It puts out fruit. The same should be and can be to the Christian that accurately understands what wisdom from above is and applies it to his life or her life. The relationship that we have with Jesus, that we're growing in, if it's happening the way it can, the way it should, the fruit will be there. We don't have to get up in the morning and say, okay, I know what the list is. I'm going to put on fruit today. No. The growing in grace, growing in him, produces the fruit. I'd go back again to the life of Ravi Zacharias. I don't think anybody ever tell Ravi, you need to kick out some fruit today. No. He was living in a passionate relationship, a growing relationship with Jesus, and the fruit just came. And just like the tomato plant, when it makes tomatoes, are the tomatoes for the tomato plant? No, the tomato plant can't really use them. Therefore, somebody else comes and picks the tomato and uses it and enjoys it and accepts it, and it's used very well. The same as the fruit of your life and my life. It's not really for me, even though I enjoy it, it makes my life fuller. It's really for someone else. We don't often think of it that way. We think the fruit is for us, for something we should see, but no. It's there for someone else to see who Jesus is, because the fruit of the Spirit of God is being lived out in our lives for the world to see. It makes our lives richer, but it's for someone else, just like that tomato plant is putting on fruit for someone else. Galatians 5:22. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Those are things you don't just pick up and act on. Those are things that come out of what John likes to call, and he uses that term many times, and I'll use it again, out of that abiding relationship with Jesus. Those are the things that flow out from that relationship. That is the wisdom that comes from above. Come from a relationship of spiritual intimacy, and you've made that relationship the reason for your life. You say, how does that work? How do I get there? How does that happen? I want that also. Let me tell you this. To me, it's to spend time on the very first things. For those of you that came to Christ years ago, you remember that moment of just exhilaration. When you realize that Jesus died for you and he promised you a life rich and full and abundant, and you're forgiven. Spend time at the first things. Remember the letters to the churches in Revelation where John says, or Jesus says, I have this against you that you have forgotten your first love. Go back to that point of your first love. Spend time there until it catches a hold at the source of your imagination, at the core of your soul, and once again becomes real and becomes passionate to you. I think of the hymn writer, the poet, Annie Johnson Flint, born in 1866, died in 1932. She was born in Vineland, New Jersey, lost both her parents before she was 6 years old. She became afflicted with arthritis as a teen and soon thereafter became unable to walk. She aspired to be a composer and a concert pianist, but when illness deprived her of her ability to play the piano, she resorted to writing poetry. Some of her poetry she set to music. Later in life, being unable to open her hands, she wrote many of her poems on the typewriter using her knuckles. One of her poems that was set to music was, He giveth more grace. He giveth more grace as the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength as the labors increase. To added afflictions he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundary unknown to men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus, he giveth and giveth and giveth again. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving is only begun. The words from someone who was crippled up as a teenager could only write on the typewriter their knuckles. But she spent time at the throne of grace and realized what life was about. She truly had the wisdom that comes from above, that gave her a relationship that brought out the words, He giveth and giveth and giveth again. Thinking of Ravi Zacharias at the end of life, or it happened just about a week ago. He was surrounded by people from his team and his family, and some of his last words, he looked up at Michael Ramsden, who's going to take over as the head of the organization. And by the way, he leaves behind not just his legacy, but he started the Ravi Zacharias International Ministry, and there's 100 what they call itinerant evangelists, men and women that go out to all corners of the world and share the hope that is within them and share the gospel of Jesus. But he shared with those people just those words. He said, keep following Jesus, keep preaching the gospel. Ravi didn't intend to retire. He had a full speaking schedule this year. The last major thing he spoke at was a group in Atlanta of 60,000 people at the Passion Conference over New Year's. But the cancer that got him very quickly. But he died in peace, saying those words, keep following Jesus, keep preaching the gospel. This week I also looked at an interview from one of the musical legends of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and 2000, the name of Linda Ronstadt. I enjoyed beautiful music, excellent music. She sold over 100 million records, had 11 Grammys, 31 albums. But a debilitating disease has taken her voice away. It's taken away her ability to walk, she can walk a little bit, but she can't stand very long, she can't sit very long, very uncomfortably because her back is in pain. The interviewer was doing the interview, just asked her, well, what's next? What's next for Linda Ronstadt? After having all that success and all the things that came with a successful career, and she looked at him and she said, well, with the disease I have, I guess it just gets worse and then you die. And see, really, at the end of life, even though she had fulfillment, she had satisfaction in life, the satisfaction you could get from a fantastically successful career. But when it comes to the end, you compare the two people about the same age. Ravi Zacharias died with those words on his lips, keep following Jesus, keep preaching the gospel. Or if you have the wisdom of the world, no matter what the accomplishments are, all that's left is it just gets worse until you die. I hope you're seeking Jesus this morning. I hope you're seeking the wisdom that comes from above so that your life will have satisfaction and purpose and meaning and value that the world, the secular world, can't even explain or define, much less experience. I hope that is your experience today. Today we're going to give some instructions for life. I'm going to ask you to think about doing 3 things. The one thing we talked about, spend time at the cross. Spend time at those first things. See if the core of your soul needs to be recharged with heavenly wisdom, with a worldview that puts you right at the center of a relationship with Jesus. A relationship that gives and gives and gives, because we serve a God who giveth and giveth and giveth again. Number 2, let's resolve to break this social distancing nonsense. We're going to stop using that term, by the way. We're going to start using the correct term, physical distancing and socially connecting. I don't have my phone. Joel, do you have a phone? Take this thing and use it for something radically different. Something you haven't done for a long time, but take this phone and call somebody that doesn't expect you to call them. And initiate that conversation and make sure you steer it towards thoughts that are heavenly wisdom, things that are above. Reach out. Don't remain. We've let this term social isolation, social distancing catch home at the level of the social, not just the physical. I was pretty good that first week. I called everybody on my list and then that was it. We all need to get back to that. Reconnect with one another. Then there's one other thing, the last example. You've all seen the flash mob things, where a band or a dance troupe shows up in some public space, a big space, a railroad yard station, an airport, a public square, and one person enters the square with either a drum or a violin or the stand-up bass, or a dancer, one dancer doing the Irish clog dancing, and one person starts that. And pretty soon they're joined by other people, and pretty soon you have what's called this flash mob doing their orchestra or their dance or their music, and it's appreciated, and it's joined by people around them. They're fun to watch. God has created a space in your life, in your neighborhood, in your area, for you to start that flash mob of entering your space and using the gifts that God has given you to reach out and live a life so that people see the fruit and they experience the fruit of the Spirit of God, not because of your effort, but because of your relationship with Jesus and what flows out of that. Thanks for being here this morning. Have a great week. Aaron, yeah. I was telling John that I was going to call him out, and he says, "What?" I says, "You used the word propitiation last week." And he says, "Well, I just slipped out." I said, "Well, that can't happen again." I said, "What we're going to do is we're going to give Joel an air horn, and he's going to be, light on the trigger, and if you use that word when we're recording, it's just going to be, and you're going to have to back up and start over. We can't be doing propitiation. We just can't. But we'll fix that. We'll fix that. Otherwise, that camera lens is somewhat intimidating. And Joel's got that little fuzzy bunny on top, and it looks like the rabbit that goes around on my game call, so I feel like I should take out a firearm and shoot it or something. But we better not do that. That wouldn't be productive.